Welcome back, Pittman Elementary. We will be continuing to read Ranger in Time, Rescue on the Oregon Trail. Want to remind everyone that we did leave off with Mr. Ferguson being ill. The next chapter is Chapter 7, A Sad Goodbye. Sam found Dr. Loring and brought him back to Sarah's wagon. Dr. Loring climbed up to check on her parents, and it wasn't long before he returned. "It's the cholera. I'm afraid they're both too far gone," Dr. Loring whispered to Ma so Sarah couldn't hear. But Sam heard. His eyes stung with tears and his throat got tight. The guidebooks all warned this trip was dangerous. The guidebooks all warned this trip was dangerous, and Sam knew that plenty of folks died on the trail. But until now, they'd been nameless strangers, not people that actual voices and faces and hands Sam had shaken. Dr. Loring sat beside Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson all night long. Sam and Ma stayed up with Sarah, worrying and wondering. Ranger stayed too, curled up next to Sarah by the campfire. He leaned his big, warm body against her. Ranger understood, sad. He remembered when Luke and Sadie's grandmother had died, and everyone cried. He understood there wasn't much he could do about sad, but snuggling sometimes helped a little, so that's what Ranger did. In the morning, Dr. Loring came to the Abbott's wagon. Sarah jumped up and started toward him. But Dr. Loring shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so very sorry." Sam watched Pa and Mr. Harrigan and the Beard brothers dig a grave for Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson. Ma tried to keep Sarah away, but she insisted on watching too. She never cried, but Sam heard her whispering numbers. She counted every spadeful of dirt, all the way up to 237. She watched as they laid her mother and father down in the prairie, said some prayers, and shoveled all that dirt back in. And then it was time to go. Sam felt like there should be more ceremony, more prayers, more time. But there were miles to be covered. They had to get through the mountains before winter. So Pa hitched up the oxen. He shouted, "Get on, Fergus! Get on, Jed!" like he did every morning. The men drove every last wagon over the grave as if they were saying goodbye. But Sam knew the real reason. He'd heard the men talking about wolves. Running the wagons over the graves packed the earth so it was more likely Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson would rest in peace. Sarah walked beside Sam and Ranger. She was part of the Abbott family for now. Ma had promised to take care of her until they got to the parting of the ways where the trails split. There, Sarah's parents had planned to take the Mormon Trail to the Salt Lake Valley, where her Uncle Aaron and Aunt Helen and all those cousins were waiting to help them settle a new farm. When the Abbotts got to the next fort, Ma planned to send a message to Sarah's relatives so they could come meet them and take Sarah to her new home by the Great Salt Lake. Every day they put more miles between Sarah and her parents' grave. She collected buffalo chips with Sam and Lizzie for the campfire each night, but she was quiet, as if part of her had died too. Only the prairie dogs made her smile. They're curious creatures, aren't they? Lizzie watched with Sarah as one little fellow peeked out of his hole. Half squirrel and half puppy dog. Ranger liked the prairie dogs too. They'd stand at the openings to their burrows, barking as the wagons approached. Prairie dogs weren't as much fun as the squirrels at Luke's house, though. Squirrels raced around the yard and over the picnic table and zigzagged through the garden. Prairie dogs jumped into their holes and vanished as soon as Ranger came near. Still, Ranger couldn't resist chasing a few along the way. He never got so carried away that he lost sight of Amelia, though. He stayed close to all the children when the wagon train crossed creeks in daytime. He kept track of them when the wagon circled at night. Ranger had come to love Sam and the rest of the Abbotts and Sarah, but he never stopped missing his home family. Each night before he went to sleep, Ranger took a walk through the wagons, sniffing the evening air. He'd smell oxen and horses and simmering stew, but never what he hoped for most, because Luke wasn't there. Each morning meant the start of another long walk. Sam tracked every mile in his father's guidebook. He looked forward to the landmarks Mr. Palmer had promised along the way. When Chimney Rock came into view, Sam nudged Sarah and pointed. It's just as Mr. Palmer said, like a haystack with a pole stick out the top. Sarah nodded, but she didn't smile. Sam had thought seeing the famous Chimney Rock might make her happier. It was a sign that they were getting closer to their new home. But when Sam thought about it, he understood. He couldn't imagine settling in a new home without Ma and Pa. 4 days later, the Abbotts and the rest of their wagon train arrived at Fort Laramie, a supply post about 1/3 of the way to the Oregon Trail. They traveled more than 600 miles from Missouri, but the flurry of activity reminded Sam of independence all over again. The air was alive with excited voices and the clang of hammers as the blacksmith went about shoeing horses and oxen. There must have been 200 wagons, along with Lakota Sioux men who had come on horses to trade. Travelers could buy flour, coffee, sugar, tobacco, powder, and lead at the fort. The Abbotts and the rest of their wagon train only camped near the fort one night. Ma sent her message off to Sarah's aunt and uncle, and they started out again in the morning. After Fort Laramie, there was another river crossing. It was deeper and faster than the others had been. Pa thought they could make it, but Ma shook her head. This current's too fast. It's dangerous, she said. So Pa paid $5 to have each wagon crossed over on a ferry boat. Sam, Sarah, Lizzie, Ma, Amelia, and baby Isaac rode in canoes with Lakota men. Ranger came too. He stayed close to Amelia to keep her from leaning too far over the swirling water. Here we are, safe and sound, Sam said after they all made it across. Ranger leaned in so Sam could pet him. But through all these days and miles, he kept wondering when his work would be done. When would Luke come and say, "Good job, boy," and scratch his ears and set out his water bowl? When would it be time to go home? There's a picture. Chapter 8, The Names on the Rock. It was good news if you reached Independence Rock by the 4th of July. That's what Mr. Palmer said in his guidebook. With about 800 miles of trail behind you, you'd be sure to make it over the mountain before the big snows came. So there was a lot of cheering and shouting when the Abbott's wagon train pulled into camp in front of the great granite rock. It was July 3rd, a full day ahead of Mr. Palmer's schedule. The Beard brothers fired their guns into the air. Mr. Harrigan played Yankee Doodle on his fiddle. Ma decided they'd have a special meal to celebrate. It looks like a big stone turtle, Sam said. Mr. Palmer says travelers write their names on the rock. Can we go see? Sure can. Pa handed Sam a tin cup of gunpowder he'd mixed with bacon grease to make a black paint, and mark your own mark as well. I want to do that, Lizzie said, shaking out a blanket and draping it over 2 barrels. Sam turned to Sarah. You should come too and write your name on the rock. Sarah shook her head and started back toward the wagon. But Ma stepped in front of her. She tipped Sarah's chin up and looked at her in the eye. You should go write your parents' names if you wish to remember them. She blinked fast and nodded. She started after Sam and Lizzie. Then Amelia came running. I come too. Ma smiled. Do you mind taking her with you? Sam sighed. Come on, Amelia. Let's go see the big rock. Ranger snuffled along behind Amelia just in case she thought to run off again. But she stayed close, happily holding Sam's hand on one side, Sarah's on the other. In a few minutes, they were standing at the base of Independence Rock. Sam started to scramble up its slope, but Lizzie grabbed his sleeve. Look at them all. She pointed at the rock with all in front of them. It was covered in names, hundreds and hundreds of names. Some were full names with dates, some just first names. They were chiseled into the rock or scratched with nails or written in looping black paint like Sam had brought. The names went on and on. There were so many, Lizzie whispered. Sarah ran her hand over the inscriptions. S. Lean, M. B. Lean. She whispered the names aloud. They were just here a couple of months ago. They ran their hands over the sun-warmed rock, calling out the names until Sarah gasped and jerked her hand back. What happened? Are you okay? At first, Sam was worried a snake had bit her. Rattlers were common out there, but Sarah didn't look hurt. She looked happy for the first time in weeks. My uncle! She pointed to a name on the wall. Sam and Lizzie leaned in close to see. It was carefully written in tar, weathered some by rain and sun and wind, but as clear as it could be. Aaron Robert Clark. She pressed her hand flat against the name as if she could reach through the stone to hold his hand. He's waiting for us in Salt Lake City. Uncle Aaron and Aunt Helen and Eliza and Martha and Abram and Mercy. They're all waiting for us to come, she whispered, and her eyes filled with tears. Well, just waiting for me now, I guess. But she smiled, and Sam thought he understood why. It must have felt good to remember she still had family. Sarah wiped her wet cheeks with her hand, and Ranger licked the salty tears from her fingers. You want to write your name next to your uncle's? Sam helped up the powder and bacon grease mixture. Sarah nodded and dipped her fingers into the gritty paint. Carefully beside her uncle's name, she wrote her own. Sarah Margaret Ferguson, July 3rd, 1850. Then she dipped her fingers in the paint and lifted it to the rock again. In. Sarah paused, then looked up at Lizzie. How do you spell remembrance? Lizzie spelled it out, and Sarah carefully marked the letters in paint on the rock. In remembrance, Rebecca Ann Ferguson and Charles Joseph Ferguson. Will you write yours close to mine? Sarah asked Sam and Lizzie. She took the cup while Sam and Lizzie wrote their names on the rough surface. Lizzie added Amelia's name too. You want to make your mark on the rock, dog? Sam grinned and knelt down. He lifted Ranger's paw, smeared it with homemade paint, and pressed it against the wall. There. Now there's a record of your journey too. Ranger sniffed his paw. The bacon grease made him hungry, but he wasn't sure what to make of the black powder mixed with it. It smelled smoky and dangerous, not good to eat. Let's climb to the top of the rock, Sam said, racing up the steep slope. Sam, wait, Lizzie called. We can't take Amelia way up there, and we should get back to camp anyway. There they are, riding on the rock. Oh, all right. Sam came down and followed Lizzie and Sarah, who each held one of Amelia's hands on the way back to the wagons. He leaned down and whispered to Ranger, You and I will have to come back on our own to explore. That is the end of Chapter 8. We will continue with Chapter 9 and 10, hopefully tomorrow. Everyone have a wonderful day.